Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, Heading to the Point, AI for All. I'm Keith Webster, the Helen and Henry Posner Jr. Dean of University Libraries. 70 years ago, AI was invented here at Carnegie Mellon, and we've been creating new frontiers ever since. The journey began with work led by Alan Perlis, Herb Simon, and Alan Newell, who were instrumental in the creation of the first computer science degree in 1961 and the Computer Science Department in 1965. Our distinctive collections hold extensive records of their groundbreaking work and pieces of vital AI history, from early AI art to initial examples of autonomous cars and other machines. Today, Carnegie Mellon is still a trailblazer in the AI world. Our top-ranked program is a leader in training the next generation of innovators to shape the future. We are uniquely positioned to take AI to places it's never been before. However, we know that there are concerns about the rapid development of the field. We need the expertise of people from many backgrounds and perspectives to bridge gaps, promote safety, and reduce inequalities. We know that bringing the CMU community together, connecting the brightest minds across disciplines, sparks bold ideas and inspires new approaches to complex topics. So we're always making introductions and fostering conversations. Today, we are delighted to facilitate a conversation, AI for All. Much of this discussion is related to equality and inclusion, and we are so grateful for our ongoing partnership with Dr. Wanda Heading-Grant, Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer. Wanda has kindly agreed to host this evening's event. In addition to her appointment as a leader at CMU, Wanda is a faculty member, a distinguished service professor in the Heinz College of Information Systems and Public Policy. Just last month, thanks to Wanda's leadership, Carnegie Mellon received the Insight into Diversity Higher Education Excellence in Diversity Award for the second year in a row. Joining Wanda tonight is Sayeed Choudhury, Associate Dean for Digital Infrastructure and Director of our Open Source Programs Office. Sayeed is also the Executive Director of the Open Forum for AI and serves on the boards of the Open Source Initiative and the Research Data Alliance United States. We're also joined by Professor Renée Cummings, Assistant Professor of the Practice in Data Science in the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. Professor Cummings is a leading expert in AI ethics, data justice, and public policy. As a 2023 VentureBeat AI Innovator Award winner, she has dedicated her career to examining the ethical implications of AI on society. Her research focuses on algorithmic policing, surveillance technology, and AI for criminal justice reform, and she's committed to promoting inclusive innovation and ethical AI. Please consider supporting the critical work happening in AI at the university libraries with a gift to our Friends of the Library Fund. Your donations support digital infrastructure on campus and the library's work to empower CMU's faculty and student scholars with the resources they need to succeed in today's information-driven society. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and without further ado, I'll turn things over to Wanda, Sayeed, and Renée.
I definitely want to thank University Libraries, Keith, for all their help and support. It has been a great pleasure to once again partner with libraries, University Libraries, and the wonderful team that's over there. I'm trying to remember if this is my third or fourth year doing Heading to the Point, but from the inception of the title Heading to the Point, which is a play off my last name, I always envisioned a platform on numerous topics that I could explore through the lenses of justice, equity, inclusion, and belonging, with the aim of building awareness and deepening conversations that motivate positive actions towards the betterment of all of us. We have such an important conversation to have today. As we know, AI is off and running and there's no going back. And it has such a great potential in so many ways in terms of using it. So it's only fitting that we here at CMU, the birthplace of AI, ask the question, how do we make sure we use AI ethically and responsibly in a way that uplifts communities, improves care, services, access, and enhances equity and inclusion, and that it doesn't cause additional harm by reinforcing biases, stereotypes, distrust, and discrimination. With that in mind, I welcome our guests here. I welcome Renée Cummings and Sayeed Choudhury, who will be here to help us think about the problems and the solutions. And I thank them for joining us for this important conversation. At this time, I would like to ask Renée to share a few opening remarks about her work and the ethics and responsible use of AI as it relates to bias, inclusion, equity, and historically marginalized identities. And then I will turn to Sayeed to share some opening remarks. And I'm specifically interested in, Sayeed, you sharing more about your role, the role of Open Forum on AI, in terms of policymaking and addressing issues of safety, equity, inclusion, and responsible and ethical use and proliferation of AI. I thank you both again for being here. And after you speak, we'll jump into some questions that will lead us into a great discussion. And I appreciate you taking the time to introducing yourself to our listeners here in this moment and at this time. Thank you. Renée?
Thank you so very much for having me. Let me say it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to be in such distinguished company. So I totally appreciate that. So I am a professor of practice at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. I joined the School of Data Science as the first ever data activist in residence, looking at questions around bias and discrimination as it pertains to algorithms against a backdrop of data justice and algorithmic justice. My work really spans the gamut. I focus on AI governance and, of course, questions around the mitigation of risks. Of course, I also look at questions around algorithmic justice and the ways in which we need to reimagine data and, of course, reimagine AI. Data equity is something that is very important to me because if we are supposed to have equity in artificial intelligence, then that equity begins with AI. But I'm actually fascinated by the imagination, and more so when I think about the intersection of imagination and AI. So questions around the ways in which we can build augmented collective intelligence, using things like augmented reality, and really inspiring a new kind of imagination and a new kind of thinking around data. So when it comes to AI, I am committed to an ethical, responsible, and trustworthy use of this technology. I work tirelessly to ensure that it's equitable and it is deployed in ways that are just, of course, diverse, and of course that we build inclusive technology. And I'm just really excited about the things that we can do. Understanding those risks and having the requisite level of due diligence is really what I'm committed to, and really ensuring that all groups get to really play with this technology, imagine with this technology, and build the kinds of tools that are required to ensure communities thrive, to ensure that legacies are created, and to ensure that we all just have an opportunity to co-create the future. So with that, I will pass it over to Sayeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Renée, and thank you, Wanda. And I echo your comments, Renée. It's a pleasure to be here and really quite an honor to be amongst such distinguished company. So I am Sayeed Choudhury. I lead the Open Source Programs Office at Carnegie Mellon University Libraries. I am also the Associate Dean for Digital Infrastructure. And as Wanda mentioned, I am leading something called the Open Forum for AI, or OFAI. And OFAI is an attempt to bend the arc toward more human-centered AI. As Wanda mentioned, the train has left the station. We aren't going to pull it back and suddenly stop the type of work that's happening. And as Renée said, there are some really interesting and profound opportunities as well. So we don't want to stop AI, but we feel like we need to bend that arc toward more responsible, ethical, human-centered AI. And at the heart of OFAI's mission is that the people who use and are affected by AI should be the ones who evaluate and affirm, or not, AI safety, responsibility, lack of bias, and so on. And if you think about other types of developments in the US around technology, that trajectory has happened with things such as automobiles or planes. We have moved to thinking more about people having a direct say in whether those systems actually are safe and responsible and operate the way they should. And I believe firmly we need to do that with AI. We plan to do that through a comprehensive, holistic approach that spans research, community engagement, building technical prototypes that are open, and then making policy recommendations based on all of that research and evaluation, and also including a human capacity building dimension through what we call talent for service, identifying people who have a more systems view of AI that incorporates engineering but goes well beyond that, and then hopefully placing those individuals within the public sector so that they can carry forward the learnings and the messages from OFAI. And I'll end my introductory comments by saying that at the heart of OFAI is openness and transparency. So Renee is absolutely correct that data plays an integral role in how we move forward with AI. We believe that should be true of the software, of the algorithms, of the design, of the various components, the various life cycle stages of AI. And we are going to work tirelessly to infuse openness and transparency throughout that entire set of dimensions for AI.
Thank you both very much. Really appreciate a lot what you said. I'm tracking 3 words in particular in terms of what you've said, which was imagination. That's standing out to me, openness and transparency. So with that in mind, I do have a question, but I also want to do justice to the opening and somewhat by making sure I say to all that's on, I am Wanda Heading-Grant. I use she, her, her pronouns. I am the inaugural Vice Provost and Dean and Chief Diversity Officer here at CMU. And I hold an appointment as a Distinguished Service Professor in the Hines College of Information Systems and Public Policy. I also want to take a step back that even though these wonderful scholars and experts have introduced themselves, I want to be able to say Sayeed is Associate Dean for Digital Infrastructure and Director of the inaugural Open Source Program Office at the University Libraries here at Carnegie Mellon and University. And so very happy to have him speaking and representing us, but also representing such an important and big topic in our world. And absolutely very much, very happy to also have Renée Cummings, Assistant Professor of the Practice in Data Science in the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. Professor Cummings is a leading expert in AI and ethics and data justice and public policy. And I will say that I've had an opportunity to listen to Dr. Cummings speak, as well as I got a chance to hear Dr. Choudhury speak as well recently about OpenAI. And so I am very pleased and honored that they're giving me the time and being able to have this conversation. So thank you. And my first question I want to ask you both, if you could share, is related to, we hear a lot about AI. And I remember the first time I sort of knew better, but when I first hear the word AI or the lettering artificial intelligence, I mean, my mind goes right to, is it the Terminator? What are we talking about? All these things jumping out at us and so forth. What are we talking about in higher education? And what is generative AI and so forth? Can you just share a little bit? We all may be at different levels and different places around artificial intelligence. Can you share a little bit more about how it plays a part in our lives, and what are some of the differences as we think about artificial intelligence and what we're talking about here today? I appreciate a few words from both of you around artificial intelligence and the different components of it and elements.
Sure, and thank you for that. And Renee is just fine, not Dr. Cummings. I would say that when it comes to AI, one of the things that I always say is that if you're asking me for a definition, I'm going to tell you that it's totally still undefined. AI is happening at the moment. We could appreciate that approaches such as data science and of course computer science and statistics and things like deep learning and machine learning and all the different types of computer learning systems that we're seeing have really given AI its lifeblood, its energy. Of course, the term has been around for nearly 60 years, but I think within the last 10 years, we're really seeing the power of this technology. I like to think about AI as a socio-technical system because we're seeing the sociological and socioeconomic and cultural implications of this technology, the impact of AI on society, the impact of data on society. When we think about Gen AI, it comes back to me to large language models and the ways in which we're now manipulating these models to come up with all variations of intelligence and creativity. When it comes to, a lot of people always ask me, isn't this technology intimidating? You know, aren't we supposed to be intimidated by it? Aren't we supposed to be afraid of it? You know, a lot of people speak from the premise of fear. And for me, I always say, you know, AI is like a tool. AI is also a style of communication. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm also so committed to AI and data literacy. You know, it is the language in which we are communicating with at the moment. As we are proficient in English and French and Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch, we need now to be proficient in artificial intelligence because this is how we communicate. Just to simplify it, I always say, if you've been doing any kind of online shopping, if you've been watching any kind of shows on Netflix, if you've been participating in any kind of social media, you have been using AI for a very long time. It's just a mathematical formula that gives the algorithm instruction. That could be a recommendation, that could be a prediction, that could be to summarize something. And it really is, to me, a form of communication in one way and a tool that we've got to become very proficient with in another way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
Sayeed,
Yeah.
what would you add?
Yeah, and if I can just build on those great comments, I just to affirm, I really like that very strong statement that we can still define AI. That this is not a case of it has been defined, it is in a final state, and that only a few large tech companies with certain amounts of compute and data and infrastructure should be the ones that define the future of AI. This is the time and the place for us to be actively involved in crafting the future around AI. You know, I will say, so I'm a trained engineer and I have used the statistical models of AI. So just very simply, I'll put it, they're just really good at pattern recognition. So if you think about training an AI model, literally one could go in and say, here's an English sentence, try to guess the next word. And it just keeps doing that with larger and larger amounts of information. And the more information you give it, the more it looks through in a mathematical way as this looks like the next word with this kind of high probability. And those are the patterns that it looks through. And if you think about the importance of data in that regard, if I only give an AI system English language content to work with, then of course, it will only understand patterns in English language. If I give it only content from Western European literature, then it'll have a Western European literature bias in terms of its view. So I did this experiment before today's gathering where I had heard, I did not actually try this, but I heard when ChatGPT came out, if you asked it, who makes the best scientist, you know, from a race perspective, and it said white men. I didn't ask that question at the time, but I don't doubt that may have been the case because of the training data that they gave it and that the patterns that it's trying to look through. Now, I asked it over the weekend, the same question. It did not give me that answer. It gave me a much more nuanced answer that it's not about race, it's about diversity of perspectives and opinions and so on. Yet when I asked for examples, it gave me 4 Europeans. Now, 2 of them were men, 2 of them were women. So from a strictly binary perspective, yes, there's that balance. But clearly there are many, many scientists outside of Europe. So I share these just to point out that they are not inherently good, bad, wrong, right. They're being trained on content. The way they make their inferences is still opaque. That is a really important point to make. So we don't have as much control necessarily as we think we might. That's an active area of research at CMU and beyond. And the generative layer basically is that it can start to create new content. right? It can come up with new ideas.
Yes.
There's a very famous case, if you happen to know the game Go, which there was a Korean world champion at the time that Google built a computer that beat him by making moves that had never been anticipated, quite frankly, by people. And I think this is an important aspect of AI being a tool, as Renée pointed out. It is a tool, but it's a tool that is influenced by our interaction with it. And we are influenced by our interactions with the tool as well. And that may be an unusual stage in our tool building and productivity building and creativity building and so on. So I think that's where a lot of the dangerous challenges come, but also some of the exciting possibilities and potential.
Yeah, I mean, you're making me think about, then it becomes important, who's who's inputting the information, who's at the table as making decisions. And it makes me want to ask the question related to policy practices and procedures. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly are we doing and CMU in your office to sort of bend that arc as we think about that? And I'm going to, what's the word? Push forward a question for Renée to be thinking about as well. One of the times I listened to you, you gave some very specific examples as well around how information is inputted, or a lack of people who are at the table from those diverse perspectives to actually begin to change the way information is handed over to us by systems, and for us to think about those things. And I love if you could share some more examples of what that could look like before we move into some of the solutions. But what does that look like on the ground, and why it makes people fearful? But back to you, Sayeed, about the bending of the arc. You gave some examples. What are we doing to have that impact in a positive way?
No, very, very good question. I'll think of that both at the individual and then at the institutional or organizational level. At the individual level, no surprise, greater participation, right? More representation in evaluating, in testing, in building, in deploying. So when I say human-centered AI is the people who are affected by the systems through the evaluation and the affirmation and so on, there needs to be more participation in building the systems as well. So one of my roles is leading the open source programs office. And if you're familiar with open source software, it has been an opportunity, and not perfect in any way, but it has been an opportunity for many people to participate in the development of the software. And I think we need more of that when it comes to AI. And clearly on the testing side. So I'll give this is a real world example that I have encountered, firsthand, mostly in airports. When you go to use the touchless faucet, right? And some of them are not designed well for skin color, darker pigmentation. And I have been sitting at one of these taps trying to get it to work, my hands underneath, with soap, sitting there going, what do I have to do to get this thing to work? And in one particular case, I actually asked the person next to me, I said, I'm really sorry, but can you put your hand under this so that the water will flow? And I can actually wash my hands. So this kind of involvement of testing doesn't have to be profound and earth-shattering. This is a very simple case, but a very important, profound one, right? Is that if we don't have a lot of different experiences, a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different participants in the testing, we will miss all of these kinds of issues and miss lots of different kinds of opportunities. One of the ways I think about DEI is that I believe there's talent everywhere, in every human group, in every corner of the planet. So if we want to tap into that talent, we're going to have more representation in this individual way. And on an institutional level, I will say that one of the key tenets of OFAI is to raise the voice of universities as a sector. So my research has been in digital infrastructure. And if you think about the internet and then you think about the web, there was a triad basically of university, government, and industry. And if you think about AI now, particularly across the those three stages, if you will, industry has become much more prominent in that triad. And that's not a value judgment per se, it's just an observation. And I think that we need to bring that balance back in terms of universities, government, industries, and maybe now philanthropy all working together. And so that organizationally, we can also think about how to bend that arc, because all of those groups have different missions, different ways of doing work, different networks, contacts, and different ways of making making an impact. So those are some of the things that we're doing right now.
Thank you. Renée, as you think about your experience in some of these things in which AI has shown up in a way that has showed stereotypes and biases that has not been as equitable, what are some of those examples that you've seen? And one of the things I remember you talking about was trust, that we have to build trust along with the right people at the table. And as Renée ponders this question, please, you all start to ask some questions now. You may start to ask some questions in the chat, so please, questions. Renée, can you help us understand that a little better, what's out there, what's going on, and about trust, and some of the examples that have given AI or certain groups of people the fear that they have around engaging with it?
Most definitely. And trust is so critical to the technology, because with trust, we build legitimacy. So trust is also critical to public confidence and the willingness to engage with the technology. You spoke about transparency. And a critical aspect of transparency is accountability, is of course, explainability, and questions around fairness. When we think about fairness, we're thinking about our data, and we're thinking about how that data has been collected, how it's been analyzed, the history of that data, whether or not that data has been used in situations where it has created trauma, whether or not we are using what I call traumatized data sets to replicate some of the past decisions. So when we think about fairness, we're thinking about equity, we're thinking about responsibility, we're thinking about transparency and trust. What we have seen, and this is why data justice and algorithmic justice are so critical to the design, development, deployment, and of course, procurement of AI, is that algorithms have the ability to create zombie predictions because of the data that's being fed into these models. And with those zombie predictions, what we continue to see is the overestimation of risk, particularly Black and Brown communities, particularly also for white communities. When we think about the ways in which algorithms impact oftentimes negatively in the criminal justice system, in the financial services, in mortgage rates, in education, in healthcare, questions around healthcare equity, who's being diagnosed, misdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, or not diagnosed at all. So when we think about the power of this technology and the extraordinary work that AI can do, and the kinds of ways in which AI can positively impact communities, we have got to ensure that all communities are having the opportunity to engage with this technology in a positive way. For me, it begins with play. Who's playing with this technology from a young age? Who's getting to imagine with this technology? Who's getting to design with this technology? Who's there when the technology is being designed? Now, these are critical questions because it all comes back to the question of fairness and this question of equity. AI equity is so critical when we think about the governance of this technology, when we think about the ways in which we need to erect those robust and sort of rigorous guardrails that we're always hearing about, the ways in which we build ethical and inclusive technology. So when we think about criminal justice, and I'm a criminologist by training and a criminal psychologist, and that is the work that brought me into AI, using risk assessment tools in the criminal justice system and seeing that we continuously were using the kinds of algorithms and the kind of data that were giving us the same types of results. So I worked from juvenile justice to gun and gang violence, and working with police officers, and working with something like homicide data, and using this kind of data to deploy police officers, which we call, officers, putting officers in specific places, and realizing that we were simply over-policing the communities that we already police. We were deploying solutions that were not community designed or community led kinds of solutions, and understanding that these algorithms were really making very high stakes decisions, life and death decisions, questions around liberty when you think about parole and many of the decisions, and questions about people's legacies. When you deny someone a loan, a mortgage, a credit, these things impact families in very real ways. And when I speak about data trauma, that's what I've been looking at, how we continuously use data and algorithms, and these algorithms transmit intergenerational trauma through communities because it's not allowing communities to thrive. It's taking away agency and self-determination. But then on the other side, you have this brilliant technology that could do so much to build more resilient and sustainable and thriving legacies. It's how do we come up with a perfect recipe? Enough ethics, enough responsibility, enough trustworthiness, and enough imagination, and enough innovation for us to really get the best of AI.
Well, that's exactly right. And I want to add a word in here in terms of the responsibility / accountability. And so what would you say or think, what is the role of the federal government in this? And in terms of oversight, watching, checks and balances, any thoughts there?
Oh, sure, definitely. Well, we had the executive order from the president last year, and early this year, I think around March, we had a federal memo that spoke to questions around civil rights, of course, and human rights, and why it is that we need public oversight, and why federal agencies need to share with the public the algorithms that they're using, of course, exempting the Department of Defense there for natural reasons, and why it's important for us to do testing, field testing, why AI safety is so critical. Why is it important for us to deploy algorithms that have been audited? Questions around algorithmic auditing, questions around impact assessments that are so critical to auditing the algorithms that are being deployed, and looking at the kinds of ways data is collected, looking at how data is being used, looking at how these AI systems are being designed. So the federal government has a critical role when it comes to ensuring that the algorithms that are being deployed are equitable, are fair, are accountable, are transparent, are explainable, non-discriminatory, and of course safe and secure, and protects our privacy. So it's quite a vast menu of things that need to be delivered. But of course, it started with the AI Bill of Rights that really outline how the administration was thinking about responsible and safe and trustworthy AI. And that led, of course, to the executive order, that, of course, to the memo. And we are here now wondering what is the future of this amazing technology.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to what's the future in a little bit. I do want to throw some of these the questions out here that from the attendees. And here's one question. Thinking about training data, how do we diversify that data? That is, have more representation, as Sayeed argues, without harming communities that have been vulnerable to extractivist exploitation that has historically not benefited them. Sayeed, do you want to take that on, or I want to share about that?
I can start. So thanks for the question. And it's spot on. I don't mean to imply there's a tension there, but there may be a tension there between getting more representative types of data, but not doing so in an extractive way, right? We don't want to basically show up and say, give us your data, trust us, we'll take care of it, and use it properly. That is not the way to go about doing this. There is a set of principles for data called the CARE principles for data. I'd encourage people to look them up, which actually has, my understanding is, has its roots from dealing with indigenous communities, right? Who have a very different relationship with data, have very different expectations of stewardship of data and so on. So we absolutely have to respect those. But I will say that there's tremendous potential in community-based data. Some of the work that I'm doing is with Professor Sarah Mendelson in the Heinz School around how can human rights research and education be, in some sense, transformed to address the Sustainable Development Goals, and what role can AI play in those efforts. And we have had a lot of experiences to date, basically, where we hear about things happening in communities well after the fact. And one sad example of that is when COVID hit society and the housing crisis was getting exacerbated. Lots of people talked about it on TikTok. Now, at some level, that's fine. I'm not picking on TikTok. That's great. But I think we can do better than TikTok in terms of getting people who are raising these kinds of issues at the community level. Data that's not typically gathered by institutions, even government institutions. Unstructured data where AI is actually really good or better than most technologies at dealing with that type of data, but to do so in a way that's respectful, that acknowledges that there may be certain data people don't want to share or don't want to share in certain kinds of ways and so on. So being very intentional about having that type of agreement relationship with the communities, but then getting that really, really rich community data at a local and disaggregated level, I think will be important for building out AI models into the future.
And I will just add, and it's something that I always say, different communities have historically experienced data differently. And we've come to realize that data has a different computational meaning versus its cultural.
I think, Renée, I don't know if you could still hear me. You've frozen. Trying to come back.
I'm sorry?
You froze during the answering of that question. It looks like, yeah, you're going in and out. It looks like I can see your movements. Can you repeat the answer to that question?
Me?
Yes, and I can hear you.
Sure. Okay, fantastic. I'm sorry about that. I was saying that historically, different communities have experienced data differently, and data has a different cultural meaning versus its computational meaning. And it's one of the reasons why I constantly promote a justice-oriented approach to data when we think about data equity. So we're talking about fairness and equity, giving us the requisite level of transparency and accountability. And of course, a trauma-informed approach that makes us understand the historic traumatic experiences around data collection, also around questions around institutional betrayal. Many communities are giving up their data and looking for something positive in return and realizing the same kind of systems, the same kinds of policies that are not allowing them to thrive. So when we think about those exploitive and extractive approaches, we've got to balance that with an understanding of data trauma and of an understanding of bringing a trauma-informed perspective to the ways in which we collect. Another aspect to me is data provenance, really looking at what I call the genealogy and ontology of the data, looking at where that data has come from and the kind of histories attached to that data. So I think it calls for a sophisticated kind of awareness, a sophisticated due diligence, and really building a sophisticated kind of consciousness that understands the political constraints, the sociological and socioeconomic. Data is very political, and we've got to understand it. Data is about power. Data is also now about self-interest. It's about profiling. It's often about victimizing, marginalizing, and sometimes undermining legacies. And we've got to understand how powerful data is. And we've got to understand that this is why data literacy is so critical. This is why data intelligence is so critical. This is why data scientists have got to understand that they have a social responsibility. They are the architects of our future, and they have got to understand what comes with that kind of responsibility when it comes to legacies, when it comes to sustainability and resilience, and when it comes to the future, which is something we all want to participate in.
Well, wow. I mean, I'm thinking, okay, is this being talked about at all levels of doing the work of AI? Are students learning this as they're coming through, secondary education? Are they learning this at conferences? Are they talking about it? Do they believe in it? Who's sharing this? I know I see a lot of advertisement for one to think about being ethnically responsible in terms of AI, doing the right thing in terms of AI. But is it really sinking in a way that we think the future will have, or even now, a positive outcome in terms of bias, stereotypes, discrimination, all these things? So much is at stake when you talk about that power. Are people listening? Do they understand? Do we feel like we're getting some traction?
Well, I will say this. I would say that there are so many data ethics programs now attached to data science programs. I know at the School of Data Science, we're really committed to that. And of course, students who engage with me certainly get that kind of understanding. But there are great communities of practice, working in the space of data ethics and AI ethics and tech ethics. I think what is required is for citizens, everyone, people, to understand the power of the data, to understand they're just not users of data, they are producers of data. And that's something that I try to get across. And when I speak about stretching the imagination of data science, it's really trying to engage with those many communities, because if we want to build this human-centric AI, if we want to do an AI that really represents who we are, we've got to bring that diversity, not only of perspectives, but experiences. We've got to think about questions around intersectionality and interdisciplinary imagination as well. So I think people are listening. The challenge is, how do we get this message from the C-suite to Main Street, so to speak, right? How do we get everyone understanding the power of data, and everyone understanding that this thing that we cannot see, that we cannot touch, that we cannot feel, it is now making decisions about us. It is now deciding the kind of access we have, the kinds of opportunities we get, the kinds of legacies we leave. And we've got to really understand that data is about rights. It's about civil rights. It's about human rights. It's about data rights and algorithmic justice, and really start having these conversations with broader audiences.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think there's reason to be optimistic, but certainly we cannot be passive. Given the consequences and the pace at which AI moves, it will require concerted, consistent effort to make sure that these messages are being heard. But I will say that there's reasonable amounts of evidence to show that even in both sides of the aisle in Washington, D.C., there is concern about what happened with social media in terms of some of the negative impacts and what lessons we can learn from that. And I think there's, and Carnegie Mellon's not the only place, but there's plenty of research in universities that is not simply focused on the engineering aspects of AI, but all those dimensions you described. And I go to a fair number of AI gatherings and conferences, and there usually is some, if not a track, but certainly several presentations around the questions around ethics and safety and so on. So by no means am I saying our work is done, but the foundations are there, and I think we have the opportunities to make sure that it continues.
Two questions that are coming to mind, and getting close to the end here. But one is this sort of a question around how we're talking about transparency, we're talking about the openness, and what about agencies and areas that aren't naturally transparent, aren't willing to share information, like the Department of Defense or other areas? How do we begin to work with entities that may have sensitive information, or that is for hopefully the common good? What do we do about those kinds of situations that we also know that also still have the responsibility of being ethical?
Well, I would say the Department of Defense also has its ethical guidelines, things that they are doing to ensure that the AI that they're deploying are safe and, of course, responsible and trustworthy. I think in that case, because most of us don't engage with that department, we're going to have to trust them. And that's when we start to think about questions now around disinformation and deep fakes and trust, right? Because we're seeing so much of that circulating at the moment. But it's a critical question. And I think what we're realizing is that many of these agencies are employing chief AI officers and AI teams, AI trust teams, AI safety teams, AI ethics, maybe not in the numbers that we would like to see, but hopefully understanding the kind of impact. You know, I always say, if you understand the risks and you understand the rights and you understand your responsibilities, then you are going to reap the rewards. And that's the only way you're going to reap the rewards without a major crisis or without having to deploy some sort of risk management strategy or reputation management strategy, because you've deployed something that's really creating traumatic experiences or risks for our particular community. So I think all agencies that are using AI, that are building these tools, understand they have a responsibility. Now, let's be honest, there will always be some entities that push the envelope, because I guess that's what innovation is all about. It is about pushing the envelope, but how far do we push? You know, what are the kinds of guardrails that we have? And what's the kind of understanding? Because we're deploying this technology on, you know, on all of us, on humans and the environment. The environment is being impacted by large language models, by data centers, by AI, by compute power. So there's a lot for us to think about. But the good thing is we're having conversations like these that are forcing us to think just a little more and just stretch our own imaginations just a little bit further.
No, I really appreciate this. As you think about that question, Sayeed, I have this one final question that I'd like for you both to answer, but absolutely add to the piece that around the openness and the transparency in terms of other agencies not providing that for us. But it made me think about, when we're talking about social media, all the things around conspiracy theory. And I was thinking about how that's really expanded out there, and how there are stories of how AI has contributed to so much that, and it takes on a life of its own. And it also takes on a life of its own, particularly in historically marginalized populations and groups, and most vulnerable. And so I think about all the unfortunate things that can happen around AI. When we think about the good things that can happen in the sphere of our power, our influence, and everyone who's listening, can you both share something in terms of what might we each do collectively and individually that you think would be really powerful for us in terms of thinking about being very ethical and responsible in terms of AI? And I certainly am open absolutely to hearing your thoughts as well, Sayeed, as we in finishing the thought around when agencies aren't as transparent.
Yeah, I'll start there and note, sorry about the cat interruption. He's the real AI expert in the family. So the Department of Defense isn't the only agency that has that concern. NIH deals with lots of clinical trials, patient trials, and so on. And for very good reasons. I don't want my clinical data being shared by NIH. So there are some legitimate reasons why agencies, universities, you name it, may not be able to share the data. But there's two things I'd say to that. One is trying to help people understand the value of openness. So even the Department of Defense, when it comes to software at least, its own policies state that they need to be open by default. And if you read the memo from the DoD about open source software, it says we gain more than we lose by being open. So it isn't a one-to-one mapping with data, I understand that, but that idea of openness, particularly as it relates to innovation, which Renee mentioned, there's a very strong connection. And now it's actually documented in terms of open source software, open data, and the innovation and economic benefits and so on. The second is, what guidance can you provide in the cases where the data can't be shared for privacy reasons, medical reasons, whatever the case may be? I've been part of an effort through a role I have on the open source initiative to try and come up with something called the open source AI definition. And one of the components is around data. And the recommendation we made, and I'm not implying this is the final word, is that if you can't share the data, then you need to provide enough detailed information about what the data are, how they were processed, how they were used, what assumptions were made in training it, and so on and so on. And you need to share the code that was used to actually process the data. And in some ways, you actually gain more insights into the data that's being used looking at the code and how it's being analyzed than you might by the data directly. In terms of your second question, what can we all do? So this may seem very simplistic, but please, everybody just try to use AI. I think the more that people engage with it and recognize how it works, even if it's just simply asking questions. I'll give you a real question I asked my system. I'm buying outdoor patio furniture. I measured the space. I tried to go to various websites and find things fitting in the space, and it was terrible. I went to ChatGPT and asked it, and it gave me a list immediately. There are simple things you can do to engage with AI. I think the more people engage, the more people identify issues, the more people find great opportunities and potential. And the more that gets fed into the collective action around AI, even in universities, the better. So just please, more participation, dip your toes in the water, and then let us know what you're finding out.
Thank you. Renee, any thoughts to what we should be doing?
Definitely. And I would say everything that Sayeed just said, and to understand this technology has extraordinary capabilities. It has extraordinary potential to really solve some of the challenges we've been struggling with as a world, as humanity. But it also has limitations. And those limitations have the ability to create the kinds of risks that we may not be prepared to deal with. When we think about speed, when we think about scale, when we think about the ways in which this technology can amplify many of those not so good things about us, about humanity, about the ways in which we think, about those historical decisions that we've made that have discriminated against, divided, undervalued, and overlooked communities. I think it is up to us. Wherever we are in our own lives, we're using data, we're using AI, and to be curious and to ask a question about the data that you're using, the algorithms that you may be using, or the models that are being built, because every organization at this moment is trying to reimagine their business model with AI and now with Gen AI. So I would say stay curious, be creative, play with the technology. I also did a little experiment myself, asking ChatGPT about who I am, what I do, the things that I talk about. And then I said, and I just did it for this assignment here today. And then I said, write a speech in the voice of Renée Cummings. And it wrote one for me, and I found it to be absolutely boring. I said, Renée Cummings has a lot more personality than that. So it had the ability to come up with the content, to put together some really nice points, but it didn't bring the energy, the personality, the experience, the curiosity of the individual. So it's a great tool. It's an excellent way to communicate, amazing capabilities, great rewards, but risks, limitations that require a requisite level of due diligence. And I always say eternal ethical vigilance when you're using AI.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I hope you all heard that. Ethical AI, I tell you, we only scratched the surface and we were in various places with it, but I hope that it teed you up to learn more about ethical AI, be responsible to who much is given, much is expected and required, and we cannot play around as if this is a joke. As we know, people's lives depend on it in many ways, and I am going to channel Renée by saying, let's put our imagination together for the betterment of all of us and do the best and good things for each of us. And you know what? And we're very blessed because we have Sayeed here. He's here on our campus. For those of us I'm talking to that are right here at CMU, as well as those of you beyond, but hopefully between these two wonderful individuals, you've learned something and that you will begin to even do more and get involved around this. Thank you both very much. Thank you to the university libraries. We are at our time. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. Hey, but you know what? Nothing ever replaces humans. So here we are doing our best of ourselves, our best thing. So thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you, Wanda.
Thank you so very much.